18 is known as All Saints' Day in Poland. It's a national holiday, and it is a big deal. It's the Feast of All Saints. It's a Christian festival. It honors all the saints, known and unknown. It's a national holiday, an important aspect of Polish culture. Everything shuts down. Restaurants, taverns, museums, all kinds of entertainment, concerts. So it's a time when nationally the Poles get together and reflect on their heritage, reflect on those who have gone before them. And there's a lot of flowers, a lot of balloons, and if you could imagine a kind of a picnic, a subdued picnic, but a picnic nonetheless, in cemeteries all over Poland. That's where they congregate. There's lots of candles, lots of flowers. Family go there to honor their ancestors, and not worship them, but honor their ancestors in terms of what they have contributed to Polish culture. It's a big deal. Everything shuts down. Barbara and I are tourists. Now what? Because there's nothing to do. Well, as it turns out, we arrived and made plans on that one day because although everything was shut down, there's one place, an iconic place, that does not shut down. And nothing you can do can adequately prepare you for what you're about to witness. We're riding in a bus, we're going down these winding roads, enjoying this bucolic scenery, and towns and families at cemeteries and candles and everything. And then you round a corner and you're faced with Auschwitz. Nothing you can read, nothing you can prepare in your own heart can adequately steel you for what you're about to see. You can go to other countries for music. You can go to other countries for their cuisine, their museums. You do not go to Auschwitz to be entertained. It's an experience unlike others. And Barbara and I have been students of World War II and fascism and those kinds of historical events for a very long time. So for us, it was not entertainment. For us, Barbara and I wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Auschwitz to try to understand a little bit more. So you go around and you go through the gates and see what was once a Polish army barracks during the 1920s when the Nazis took over in 1939 and converted that facility into a concentration camp and later into a death camp. That's what we went through. And it begs the question, how could this be? How could a rational, cultured society engage in the kinds of activities that went on there? Auschwitz is not just one place. Auschwitz is a whole complex and a system of concentration camps, death camps, forced labor camps. There were factories, it was in a small town, but there were factories and other labor camps around them to extract the maximum amount of slave labor out of the Poles before they were exterminated. So it was a continual process. This iconic picture is a picture of Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau is basically one big complex. And we toured those facilities for the barracks and the crematoriums and everything else. So it was a city, it was a residence of death, is what it was. And it was systematically designed to extract the most amount of labor and fear and torture out of the inhabitants there. As you walk through the facilities, it becomes evident that in the midst of this horrible situation, many people gave up and abandoned their faith, thinking there cannot be a God in this place, or God surely either does not exist, or God surely does not care if he did not intervene in a place like this. This picture was of a Jesus on the cross, and it was scratched into the walls in one of the death chambers as people were being held until their death, either by gas or by firing squad or by hanging or by beating and torture. One individual or a number of individuals scratched this iconic symbol onto the wall of Christ on the cross. So even in this residence of death, there were remarkable examples of faith. And as we read and as we read about these things, there was active ministry going on in the midst of this horrible, horrible situation. So it's amazing when we walked through this place. On the one hand, you are absolutely stunned by the level of human depravity. What is in the human heart? How could a society that produced Germany is often thought of as the birthplace of the Reformation. Many fathers of the Reformation came out of that culture. How could a culture like that produce ultimately the fascist machine that was responsible for the death of millions and millions and millions of people? But on the other hand, you saw incredible acts of generosity, sharing, and ministry. One of the martyrs of that period of time was a Catholic priest by the name of Father Maximilian Kolbe. He was rounded up and was put into the concentration camp, not because he spoke out politically, but because he was simply a person of faith. Poland is overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. About 95% of the population is Roman Catholic. And the faith there in that country is a big deal. Whether or not it's a mechanical faith by routine or an active, heartfelt response to God's calling, I'm not here to judge. But as I said, on All Saints' Day, the whole country shuts down in remembrance of the dead and in honor of the dead. And in many, many areas, the faith of the people, the faith of the population is a big deal. And there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of ministers, priests, nuns. Who is the famous Protestant minister that was executed in the concentration camps? His name escapes me right now. Bonhoeffer, yes. So there were thousands of examples of people who were incarcerated, tortured, and murdered simply because they were Christians. That theme will come up from time to time during these presentations. Why Christians? What's so threatening about Christians? What is so threatening about the Christian church that they must be eradicated? And so Father Kolbe was incarcerated at Auschwitz, and he ministered to others, prayed for his tormentors at the time. And this one picture is of a memorial in his death cell where he was packed in with a number of other prisoners and simply left to starve to death with no food and no water. The scale of the institutionalized brutality stretches the limits of credibility. This was not a small group of fanatics. This was not one individual maniacal serial killer. This was a machine of death that was authorized by and facilitated by the state against people whom they deemed unworthy of life. This one picture shows luggage. When they were transported to the concentration camps, they were told to bring what valuables they could. So they packed valuables, they packed money, they packed jewels. Of course, the purpose of that was to confiscate that wealth upon the arrival and to facilitate the Nazi war machine. So they were told, put your names, put your addresses, put your identification on your suitcases so they can be set aside, and when you're transported to another work camp, you can be able to pick up your belongings. So they were deluded into thinking that nothing would actually happen to them, that they were actually going to a work camp or a labor camp, but at least they would be able to take their things. Well, they not only left their luggage, but they left absolutely anything that could be used to facilitate the Nazi war machine. The upper right picture is a picture of human hair. There's a whole room full of bales and bales and tons of human hair that was bundled up and shipped to Germany to be used for the war effort in things like mattresses, pillows, clothing, anything that could be extracted from a human body to facilitate the war machine. The picture on the lower right are spectacles. Absolutely everything was taken, including teeth, hair, clothing, for this facilitation of the effort. It's interesting as you walk through these barracks and as you walk through these rooms and you're confronted with this horror that there's not a lot of idle chatter. People are stunned and they become very reserved and very quiet. The most troubling and significant portion is on the tour when you are allowed to walk through the gas chamber, the death chamber itself. You're allowed to take pictures. You're encouraged to ask questions. You're allowed to linger and read the signs. But when you walk through the death chamber, the people who operate or facilitate this as a living memorial ask that you have absolute silence. So how do we explain the unexplainable? How can it be? Well, in reading accounts of people's experiences at Auschwitz, many came to the conclusion that there must not be a God at all. If there was a God, how could God allow such a horror to take place in his creation? So many people thought there is no God. Of course, in the ancient world, there were thoughts of multiple gods. There was a god of weather, there was a god of agriculture, and these people, these different gods, were often in conflict with each other. That's not really held anymore, but there is a prevalence of thought out there that there is a God, but with a kind of a split personality, or a God who is evolving. a God who changes his mind according to the times. And it's our job to kind of figure out what God was thinking or what God had as a personality at that time. It's not only an ancient thought, but it's quite a modern thought. And one of the ways that is expressed is that there's an Old Testament God and then there's a New Testament God. I wouldn't want to live during a time where there was an Old Testament God, but it's thought, aren't we glad and aren't we fortunate that God has kind of come around and God has a different way of thinking. So this idea that there's a progressive God that goes along with a progressive society, right? We hear that term a lot, progressivism. That there's a progressive God who is much more reasonable, much more understanding, and is much more in tune with the way people are thinking and what people's needs are. And also there might be some sort of a distant supreme force of the universe, something out there, but really this is a God or a force that is really not self-aware or self-directed. Many of you are old enough to remember when the Star Wars series came out, and there were many people that were introduced to the Force. Remember that? The Force. And a lot of people thought, aha, that's the sort of thing that we're looking at in the universe, is a force, some sort of a force field. And then we understand that according to the script of the movie, that there's a dark side of the Force. Kind of a dark side of our personality versus the nice side of our personality that we'd like. Well, God is somehow reflected in that as well. Any thoughts, questions, interactions? No? You can put me on the spot. Well, I thought about a quote that I have enjoyed from time to time, is that God made man in his own image, and man was so appreciative that he decided to return the favor. Isn't that what we see in many cases today? This idea that God and man is in some sort of a partnership to make things better as we go along. And certainly, if we take a look at Germany in the 1930s and the havoc that the Germans and the Imperial Japan foisted upon the world, aren't we glad that we're kind of past that? You know, that was a real big mistake. But we've learned so much from that dark experience that we don't have to worry about that anymore. So when we try to bring in, well, what about the Nazis? What about the Soviet Union? A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, I object to that. How can we compare how people behave against those perceived as foreign enemies or outsiders? In other words, the Third Reich and what they eventually manufactured against the Jews. And it's different when we hold differences with those who are part of our own nationality or a part of our own ethnicity. We don't really react the same way as the Germans of the 1930s did toward those people. Well, other things that we've done, Barbara and I, because we're students of history and students of the Second World War especially, we also decided to take a little deeper dive into the Russian Revolution of 1918. Again, how could this happen? Well, the Nazi Germany was an aberration, and there's a contemporary flirtation with socialism, not the nasty socialism of the Soviet Union, but the good socialism of the way we can do it. We can reinvent We can reinvent socialism to kind of fit the package of what Americans are interested in doing. Because after all, there's something about us, there's something about our hearts that's fundamentally different than the hearts of the fascists in the 1930s. Surely you've picked up that I jest by now. One of the things that we need to do, both as parents, as grandparents, as teachers, and as children, is to revisit and visit our contemporary history. One of the books that we just don't look at in our society, or one of the books that we certainly don't teach in high school, is a book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called The Gulag Archipelago. The Gulag Archipelago was written by Solzhenitsyn, and it recounts his own personal experience going through the system of being arrested, interrogated, dehumanized, tortured, transported, and ultimately he was released in I think it was about 1956. I can't quite remember. But it recounts events that are contemporary. I mean, I might take good comfort in saying, what time do we need to cut this? Am I okay? 10 minutes, okay. One of the things that we take comfort in is anytime we see aberrant behavior out there, we like to say, that happened in the ancient world, right? We're different. We've learned, we've progressed, we've come a long way, baby. And so it's comforting to say, well, my goodness, those things that took place in the 1930s in fascist, that was before my time. I wasn't born during that time. So I take a little bit of misplaced comfort in thinking that was in the past, that was in history. But the Gulag recounts events in the Soviet Union that took place upwards all the way up until the fall of the Soviet Union. So these kinds of things took place in a contemporary time where I was alive, and many of you were alive as well. So in taking a look at the Russian Revolution of 1918, one of the things that Stalin went after those people who were thought of as successful farmers. Back then, there was no such thing as the middle class. But the closest thing that you could come to in Russian society was a group of successful farmers that were energetic, talented, and smart enough to actually acquire a house that might be made out of brick or wood instead of mud. Acquire a cow, a couple pigs, have a few acres of land. They were thought of as successful. And the kulaks, or wealthy farmers, especially in the Ukraine area, or Russia, they were targeted by the Bolsheviks because they presented the greatest threat against the regime. So here you have a direct refutation of the idea that, well, sometimes societies move against those because of some racial background or foreign nationality. But here's a prime example of millions of people who were tortured, their lands were stripped of them, they were thrown into prisons, they were killed. The collectivization of the farms during the Stalinist time was complete because they presented a threat against the regime. Millions of innocent farmers were taken, their homes were taken from them. And I'd like to kind of speed along and also finish up by reading something that Solzhenitsyn wrote about when he recounted his experiences. It's not necessary that you would try to plow your way through all 700 pages of a 3-volume Gulag, because Solzhenitsyn, before he died, authored a revised version. And this is not some other author picking and choosing and cherry picking. This was Solzhenitsyn himself authorized a slightly smaller version that is only about 460 pages long. It's not very light reading, but this is a book that every one of us should have an understanding of. This is a book that every high school student should read. I'd like to read one of his accounts. When it talked about the destruction of religion and the destruction of Christians in the Soviet Union, he recounts that, he says, however, the root destruction of religion in the country, which throughout the 20s and 30s was one of the most important goals of the KGB or the secret police, could be realized only by mass arrests of Orthodox believers, monks and nuns whose black habits had been a distinctive feature of old Russian life, were intensively rounded up on every hand, placed under arrest, and sent into exile. They arrested and sentenced active laymen as well, not just ministers, but active participants in their faith. The circle kept getting bigger as they raked in ordinary believers as well, old people, and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all. Ladies, you've been warned. Most stubborn believers of all, and who for many long years to come would be called nuns in transit prisons as in camp. True, they were supposedly being arrested and tried not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their convictions and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. So, if you take a look at a socialist paradise, one of the first things that they want is a detachment from faith, and particularly Christians. There's a picture of a prison camp where people were interred before exile, or as they were exiled, and this took place in the 1950s. So, I've painted this bleak picture intentionally to shock us into thinking, how could this happen? Does it happen quickly, overnight, through foreign invasion, some political system being foisted upon us, or does it happen gradually, as it did in Germany during the 30s, where slowly people were forced or indoctrinated to change their minds? In the 20s and the 30s, in Russia, because of the way people were interrogated, indoctrinated, changed, threatened, that they became kind of the marching orders. So, one common goal that we're going to be seeing is, as we discuss various worldviews, we have to do that. We have to open ourselves up to discussing various worldviews, and something becomes nature. It's the nature of man, and our compulsion to resort to evil as a basic human trait. The Bible describes this as our fallen nature, a fallenness. It's reflected in a personal fallenness when we morally fail to do what we are supposed to do. It results in a collective fallenness when a society or a nation engages in a path that ultimately leads to places like Dachau or the Gulag in Siberia. And again, this idea that our God is a progressive God and our society is a progressive society, and by partnering with God, who is a much more understanding God than the Old Testament God, that somehow we will have a false hope that we've gained understanding. We're less violent. We're more tolerant than we were in the past. So it's not a pretty picture, but I think we need to face ourselves in those kinds of possibilities. Any questions or thoughts? Yes.
To realize the history of their country. And it got me to thinking, where in our country do we visit and understand slavery?
Right.
I mean, slavery existed longer in the United States than what the tragedy that happened in Germany. And so it got me to thinking, what is our reality? How do our children, the thing you're speaking to, how do our children understand?
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, because collectively we are and have been anesthetized from the social reality of some of these things going on. And when you point out that every child is expected to visit the concentration camp, not every German child is expected to make a pilgrimage to Auschwitz, which is in eastern Poland, but there are plenty of death camps and plenty of. They must confront their own past and deal with that. When we were there, we saw hundreds and hundreds of Jewish children, some with religious banners around their necks, or the actual flag of Israel pinned on their back, and they came from all over Europe. Because when the Jews say never again, they mean it. They mean that they are not going to be looking at those kinds of things with an anesthetized or a pair of fogged over glasses. Pastor, you want to close in prayer or any? Okay. No other questions? No other thoughts? And as we go through this series, we'll try to tie some of these things together, including the idea that the one common denominator is, as we individually, or I'm pretty sure that I'm in sync with you, as we individually or as we collectively step back from God in our society, we open ourselves up more and more to the reality of the death camp or the gulag or the kind of senseless violence and chaos that we could see around us. So let's close in prayer. Lord, as we embark upon this study, we are going to face many uncomfortable facts of our history and of our contemporary society, and most of all, what is embedded within the human heart. With your grace, with your mercy, we're going to examine these things full on and overcome the tendency to go down the same path. So let us go away from here, if not joyful, at least mindful of the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. And we ask for continued grace to do these things in Christ Jesus. Amen.